that there's anything that's matured sufficiently since that time.
I mean, you're wrong, but that's a good.
So, a related question in terms of as an embryo person, when do we become human beings? Get fertilization. Then you can get into this whole issue of different types of contraception as to whether that's consistent with God's view. I'm not going there tonight, but clearly fertilization is the beginning of life. Now, what has the Obama administration done since its presidency? By the way, tonight is not political, tonight is spiritual. So let's just look at this issue and see what's happened. Now, Bush made it very clear. Embryonic stem cell use, cell lines were capably used for research if those cell lines had already been generated prior to his statement in August of 2001. Dr. Fisher claimed that only about 20 of those 84, I think, lines were really viable and capably used for research. Well, then Obama, one of his platform positions during his election was in the area of embryonic stem cell research. On March the 9th, 2009, Executive Order 13505, the statement by Obama was that the Department of Health and Human Services, through the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, may support and conduct responsible, scientifically worthy human stem cell research, including human embryonic stem cell research, to the extent permitted by law. How's that for a statement? Like any other legal document, this goes on for pages and pages and pages. All right. Then, 3 days ago, on July 7th, 2009, his statement on March the 9th became law. We now have law passed in terms of how stem cell research should be legislated. The first point on July 7th, which was somewhat of a modification of the statement back on March 9th, was that the NIH, again, the National Institutes of Health, $30 billion of your dollars every year goes to fund biomedical research. And I've been privileged to have support over most of my time in academic medicine. So I thank you as taxpayers for supporting research. And I think if you look at whether people are conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat, most people think that spending their tax dollars on biomedical research is a worthwhile thing to do. I mean, we've all benefited from this. We live longer, we're healthier, the quality of life is much better. There's no argument here, but this says that the NIH will create a stem cell registry listing the lines that are available for federal funding. And federal funding is restricted. Now, this is not every line, but it's restricted based on certain qualifications. And there's going to be a working group formed. That group has not been formed. This was just stated on July the 7th, 3 days ago. There's going to be a working group formed to review the eligibility of stem cell lines that are created before the guidelines became final on July the 7th. So now we're going back historically to look at lines that are already in existence but were not approved previously for federal funding for biomedical research. Now remember what California did. California said, we're not going to wait for the federal government. We're going to put $3 billion into stem cell research right now. And has anybody seen budgetary statements from the state of California recently? Ooh, boy. The second point on July the 7th was that we're now going to open up the opportunity of cell lines that are formed in other countries to be transported to the United States and be made available for NIH funding. Okay? So that's the new position. Let's look at the so-called religious group view of embryonic stem cell research. The Catholics prohibit it. The Ecumenical Orthodox Church, which would include the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church, prohibit embryonic stem cell research. The evangelical Christian community prohibits embryonic stem cell research. But look at this. Mainline Protestantism, the Muslims, the Jews, and the Buddhists all view this as acceptable research. Oh, I'm sorry. You're correct. It does say prohibited. Good. My bad. Okay, so the Buddhists prohibit it, but the mainline Protestants, Jews, and Muslims, in fact, accept embryonic stem cell research. Now, I'm going to raise another question for you. Is the issue with embryonic stem cells one of origin and/or implantation? Think about that one. We'll come back to that. And what do we do with all those frozen embryos? Well, here are the data that are fairly recent. So remember now, a couple goes for the potential mother of an unborn child to be implanted with this fertilized embryo, but they don't use all the embryos. And remember, multiple births are fairly common after this because they tend to put several in to make sure some of them implant. So it's not unusual to have twins or triplets occasionally from this. And this woman, more recently had 8 kids, something like that. Anyways, the questions comes up with her is what was she doing, going through this anyway, but all that aside. But here's what happens. 80-some% of these are still maintained in the freezer. And when a physician, a reproductive endocrinologist or gynecologist goes to get these embryos, the success rate for implantation for each one is about 20%. So right now, 80% of these embryos fail when harvested from the freezer in terms of successful implantation. Now, up here, 2.8% of embryos are used for research. 2.3% are donated to others, not the presumed parents, but to a surrogate mother. Discarded represents 2.2%, and other, which is this, that, and the other thing, is 4.5%. Now, something that I think is quite interesting, and I can't read this to you, but the state of Oregon in October 2008 ordered that frozen embryos be destroyed and considered part of the property rights issue, that there's full ability to make decisions of destroying embryos rather than storing them indefinitely. That's the state of Oregon. And other states have variable legislation on the same issue. What do you do with these frozen embryos? You have human life now that's in the freezer. And keep in mind now, a couple may have one child, maybe go back for a second one sometimes later, but there's going to be a lot of embryos that are in the freezer. Now, what happens to those? And they're stored for family planning. But how many and how long is unclear. So what's the biblical perspective? And then we're going to change the tune of this story a little bit and kind of move into where this field is really moving right now, which I think is semi-encouraging. Well, we're created in the image of God. Genesis 1:26-27, and God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." So God created man in his image.